If you know you struggle for time, then the interpretation section might be the section that you start with. But before you do that, you really must look at the sources, because you need to use that in 3B. And you need to be able to kind of refer back to those sources. And they also might give you some handy hints. You might be able to include some of their information as your own knowledge in part of the 20-mark question, particularly if you're stuck. However, obviously, really should know lots of your own knowledge to be able to put into that one. So before you begin then, you need to evaluate your interpretations. So you will get a separate booklet. Now on the first page will be sources B and C that you would use in your how useful question. It's really important you do not mix them up with your interpretations for these last few questions, or you will get absolutely no marks. So in your interpretations then, at the bottom of the page, I would do a very quick table. So planning, remember the grade 9 student plans. So I would look at the question and I think, so I've just chosen a question for this one about reasons for purges. So I have put a quick table, interpretation 1, interpretation 2. As I've read my interpretations, what I've done is I've ticked if anything has appeared in that interpretation about that issue. So that way I can judge if there's 3, for example, factors that appear in that. I might say, well, actually, that's a stronger interpretation in my judgment because it is a wider, broader source. If it's only talking about one issue, yes, it might be really truthful, but actually it's only not kind of considering this aspect, and it might ignore the whole majorly important aspect, which might be the economy, or it might be the rivals, etc. So this just helps me to remind me about judgments and to make me think about the differences and the similarities between the sources. So we have the example here then about why Stalin won the struggle for power against his rivals. So you'll see that I've got Stalin, Trotsky's mistakes and luck as my issues. And then I've got I1 and I2, and I've ticked from the sources and underlined out. Obviously you'd use a highlighter in the exam, but it comes up a bit weird on the screen. Anything that I think I might be a short, sharp quote that I might be able to use. And I've just written my judgments at the side of I1 ignores Stalin, and I2 is very narrow because it just focuses on Stalin. But I put a ring around some really persuasive language that I can see there from Ben Walsh's book. So before you get onto the 20-mark question, you need to complete the 2 4-mark questions. Now, if you follow the right structures, you should be able to pick up these 8 marks. So this is, what is the main difference between these views? So you'll see there I've got another example from an exam board examiner's report, which is why it's always really good to go through and read and see what they're doing. So sentence 1, what is the main message in the interpretation 1? And use a quote from that interpretation. Sentence 2 is obviously the quote from interpretation 1. And then sentence 3 is going to be in contrast because you're looking for a difference. Interpretation 2, and then what the main message is of that interpretation. Then sentence 4 is going to be our quote from interpretation 2. That is all you really need to do. So you can link your quotes back to what you've said in the interpretation for the message. So we'll see this example here says, interpretation 1 gives the view that the weaknesses of Trotsky was the reason, now you might say the main reason, why Stalin won the struggle for power. Many old Bolsheviks saw Trotsky as an outsider. That's a nice quote from the interpretation. It emphasises that Trotsky was arrogant and came across as disloyal. That was in the interpretation. However, interpretation 2 gives the view that the strengths of Stalin was the reason why he won the struggle for power. Stalin was a clever politician who planned his attempt to gain power carefully. It emphasised that he used Lenin to gain popularity and that he was ruthless. So that is all you need to do to gain those 4 marks. And you can do obviously lots of practice, perhaps go through your books and use those examples of interpretations that are in there, thinking about the key issues. So this one is the trickier one. So you just literally got to learn the structure on the screen in front of you. And then you've got to insert the bits that are relevant for the sources at the time, that of the how useful question, that will match up to the bits of the interpretation that you pulled out. So interpretations 1 and 2 may give different views as they've used different sources to reach their conclusion. So think about the types of sources that you can see on the page in front of you. So are you looking at propaganda sources from Stalin? Therefore, he's going to present it himself as a success. Are you looking at Western sources? And therefore, they're going to suggest that communism is a failure. Okay, So if you have a look at the answer on the screen, they don't go into the very specifics of the sources there in the one on the screen, but you can, because obviously you can talk about the type of source that it is. So I would always structure my way, starting off with they give different views as they view different sources to reach their conclusions. Interpretation 1 focuses on, then look at the message, maybe a quick quote, and may have used sources like, and then go to the source from the how useful question. So I've got an example here of source C, propaganda, which would show star successes. This is seen in the interpretation when, so pulling out an example if you didn't do it earlier. Interpretation 2 focuses on, and again the message, and may have used sources like, go back to those sources again from the how useful, it would be the opposite one. Adds, this would show blah blah blah, and this is seen in the interpretation when. So if you do this, you're going to get those 4 marks. And what it's done is helped you to kind of look in a bit more depth at the interpretations and the kind of main messages so that you're ready for your 20-mark question. So you're now ready to do your 20-mark question. Now remember, 4 of these marks are for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So for those of you doing Weimar, Germany, or for those of you doing Russia, you've got to think about putting a bit of time and effort in your revision to learning key spellings like dekulakization, like Stakhanov, etc. Now, to succeed at this, you need to make a judgment, okay? And that's why I kind of looked at judging when you're doing going through the interpretations and annotating them. So I have looked at the examiner's reports. These are the kind of ways that seem to be the examples that are pulled out that are successful. And these are the way that our students do this. So, introduction then. Key messages of both interpretations and which one convinces you the most. Now, it will in the question only talk about one interpretation. Okay, that is really, really, really essential that you do both. Otherwise, you're limiting your marks to half. So, there's an example of an introduction next, which we'll talk about in a minute. Strengths of interpretation 1. This is only focusing on the content. You don't need to look at the author, the date, the country that it's come from, anything like that. But you might look at the strength, you might look at the language that they use and whether you agree with it. Weaknesses. So what perhaps of the areas that they're talking about are they not able to deal with in this extract? And then an interim judgment. How far this is convincing to you? Do you agree with it? Okay, because that's putting it in for that top level. Strengths of the other interpretation, weaknesses of the other interpretation, and your conclusion, how far and what convinced you the most. Now, the way that you're going to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses, you're going to pull out a specific quote, and then you're going to match it up with very specific own knowledge and link it to those consequences, what it means for the question. So an example of an introduction here then, remember to judge. Interpretation 1 is very convincing when it suggests that Trotsky made many mistakes in the struggle for power, whilst also highlighting luck, but is slightly weakened by ignoring Stalin's important role. So therefore you've got all the judgments in there. Interpretation 2 is narrow but convincing, when it shows the important role Stalin played in outmanoeuvring his rivals. So again, you're telling me the message there, but you're also telling me like what you think of it. It is weaker than interpretation 1, as it doesn't recognise his rivals' mistakes. So very clearly here, I've got to set out an argument that I'm going to argue throughout my answer. Now, if you think you're going to struggle with writing things up quickly under time pressure, you don't want to write out interpretation 1, interpretation 2 all the time. In your introduction, if you put in brackets I1 and I2, then the examiner knows that that's what you're referring to. It's not ideal, but obviously if you're running out of time, it's a good way to save you a little bit of time. So from our examiner's reports then, you will see this structure of the strengths and the weaknesses. So you will see in red, short, sharp quotes, please, from the interpretations. Then we've got more evidence, and then we've got their analysis where they're linking it back to the question. So interpretation 2 gives a positive view of Stalin, stating that he was a clever politician. Now, I would add in there how convincing it is to me, okay, whether I agree with it or not, who often linked himself with Lenin. Lenin was seen as a god, the cult of Lenin, so Stalin photoshopped himself into many photos with him to make it seem like they were good friends. Okay, so that's really good detail, that's really good evidence. So then we're going to our analysis. This gained the support of the public as they felt that Stalin would carry out Lenin's wishes. So we're thinking about consequences for the reasons why he wins. Going back to our evidence, Stalin also lied to Trotsky about when Lenin's funeral was, so Trotsky would lose support. Making Stalin seem better, you could expand on that a little bit more. Stalin's job as general secretary gave him lots of power and and information. Although it seemed like a boring job, this allowed Stalin to undermine his opponents as they underestimated his abilities and thought he was boring. Walsh emphasises how smart Stalin was, using words like extremely. Stalin was also seen as who understood the feelings of the people, which made him seem patriotic and talented. Therefore, Stalin gained lots of support and gained lots of power. However, interpretation 2 does not mention the fact that Lenin didn't want Stalin as leader. So this is not focusing on what is actually missing, it's focusing on Stalin, which bits he's missed out, talking of Stalin in the interpretation. And it's linked it back to the consequences there. Now, I would add an interim judgment here about how convincing this is overall. And then it goes on to do exactly the same in interpretation 1. So remember, the key important things are following through the strengths and the weaknesses, thinking about your evidence to match up with what's being said in the interpretations, and thinking about what this means for the question overall. Now, the reason why this answer starts with interpretation 2 is interpretation 2 was in the question. That is absolutely fine, but what I tend to find is sometimes students then forget to do the other interpretation, and they just say, oh, well, it only said interpretation 2 in the question, and they've not read the bit that says, explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge. So it is absolutely crucial that you do the same for the other interpretation, or the maximum marks you can actually get are half marks, and then obviously you get your spag on top of that. But don't forget that you're going to be missing out a significant amount, and this will limit you massively. So don't think, oh yeah, well that's all right because I'll get half marks. You've got to do a stunning answer to get full on half marks for that part of the paper. So make sure you're doing interpretation 1 and 2. If you know you're going to get a bit stuck or you're going to get to the end, then always start with interpretation 1 and then go on to interpretation 2. It doesn't matter what order you do them in, as long as you cover them both and you link it back to the one in the question saying, you know, I agree more with interpretation 2, or I don't agree with interpretation 2, I agree more with 1, as part of your conclusion in your introduction. Conclusions are always really tricky to do. So this is the one where you're talking about which one you agree with most and what's convinced you the most about it. Okay, so here we've got an example. Interpretation 1 is the most convincing interpretation as it recognises the importance of the failings of Trotsky, which Stalin was able to use to his advantage. It does fail to cover Stalin's active role, but without Trotsky's arrogance and lack of alliances, Stalin would not have been able to gain control. Now, you probably already argued that throughout, so remember, it's not kind of just going over exactly what you've done before, but it's saying that actually if this arrogance wasn't there, then Stalin wouldn't have been able to capitalise on it and wouldn't have been able to gain that tight control. So this is kind of saying that what has convinced me the most, and it's saying that I found one most convincing. So use the wording of the question. You can go back and say, actually, I don't agree with interpretation 2 at all, or I partially agree with it. So have that judgment, have that how far you're agreeing. This one for me is the most convincing, therefore I'm agreeing more with interpretation 1. So making sure that you get those judgment words in to get those top marks. So in your textbooks, there'll be plenty of examples of interpretations. On the exam board website, they've got all the past papers that are up there from the different years. The only ones that will be locked are the ones that are there from the previous year, because you could be using those for mocks more often than not. So what you need to do is you need to go on, have a look at those, download those papers and do lots of practice in this. So thinking about inserting that specific information. Right, good luck.